Marcus Carter felt the death before he saw it. His palm pressed flat against the bark on the southwest side of the trunk, and the give underneath told him everything. Not the solid resistance of living wood. Something spongy. Something that had already surrendered. The cambium underneath was dry and brown. Dead. Same spot every time, he whispered. Except this one. Number 9 in 3 winters. He traced the wound with his index finger, mapping the familiar pattern: southwest exposure, bark split clean like someone had taken a blade to it, the tree's own circulatory system cooked by reflected sunlight during the day and frozen solid when the temperature dropped at night. He'd seen it first on a harvester 3 Januaries ago. Then a Redhaven the following winter. Now a contender, which was supposed to be bred for this climate, supposed to handle the swings. The tree didn't care what it was supposed to do. Are the trees sick again? She asked without looking up. He was spreading photographs across the kitchen table, 9 of them now, each one showing a different dead tree from a different angle. And now he was circling the southwest-facing bark damage on every single one with a red marker. The circles made a pattern. The pattern told a story nobody else seemed interested in reading. Dad. I heard you. He capped the marker. It's the same thing. Southwest side. Sun hits it during the day, warms up the bark, sap starts moving. Then the temperature drops 15 degrees in an hour and the cells rupture. Sunscald. Lily spooned cereal into her mouth. You said that word before. I know. Last year you said it. I know, baby. So why's it still happening? He looked at her. She was watching him now, cereal forgotten, and there was something in her expression that wasn't quite a child's curiosity. It was closer to worry. She'd learned to read him the way he'd learned to read the trees, by paying attention to the small things, the silences, the things that didn't get said out loud. Because I haven't figured out how to stop it yet, he said. He gathered the photographs into a stack and slid them into a manila folder alongside 3 years of packing house receipts and a spiral notebook with a cracked cover. The notebook was filled with his handwriting, dates, locations, tree varieties, temperature logs, notes scrawled in the margins about wind direction and cloud cover. Next to the folder sat the checkbook. He'd balanced it last night. $4,076. That was what remained after the medical bills from Claire's illness, after the funeral, after 3 years of pulling from savings to keep the orchard running while the yields kept dropping. The packing house receipts showed the story in numbers: 840 bushels the year Claire got sick, 712 the year after she died, 503 last season. This year's harvest was still 4 months away and he already knew what the trend line looked like. Claire's photograph sat on the windowsill above the sink, the spot where she used to stand and watch the orchard bloom every April. She'd loved the pink. She'd said it looked like the whole world was blushing. In the photo she was 31 years old and laughing at something off camera, her hair pulled back in a scarf, her hands dusted with flour from whatever she'd been baking. She'd been gone 3 years and 2 months. Lily had been 6 when they buried her. Marcus looked at the photograph for a beat too long, then turned back to the table. The county extension office smelled like old carpet and pesticide samples. Marcus sat in a plastic chair across from Robert Gaines, who was somewhere in his 60s and had been giving agricultural advice to Calhoun County farmers for 3 decades. He was a decent man. Marcus had known him since he bought the orchard 12 years ago, back when he was still a young black man with a new wife and a crazy idea about growing peaches in a state that wasn't exactly famous for them. Gaines flipped through the photographs, nodding slowly. He was a professional nodder. He'd learned that nodding bought you time to figure out how to say something that wasn't going to help. This is Sunscald, Marcus said. Look at the pattern. Every single tree, southwest face, bark splitting in the same orientation. Saturday morning broke cold and clean, the kind of February cold that got into your knuckles and stayed there. Marcus carried the first 5-gallon bucket of white latex paint from the bed of his truck to the southwest corner of the orchard, where the damage was always worst. The bucket was heavy. $312. He'd written the check carefully, watched the numbers subtract from $4,076 in his head. Lily settled herself on an overturned bucket near the first row, a library book open in her lap. The Science of Fruit Tree Propagation. She'd checked it out on her own, hadn't asked him, had just walked to the school library and found it in the agriculture section. She was 7 years old and she read like she was preparing for an exam that nobody else knew was coming. Marcus dipped the wide brush into the paint and started on the first trunk. The latex was thick, almost too thick for the cold air, and it pulled against the bark as he worked it upward from the soil line. 4 feet up to the first scaffold branches. The southwest side got painted first because that was where the afternoon sun hit hardest in late winter, warming the bark just enough to wake the cambium layer, fool the sap into moving, and then the temperature would drop 15 degrees in an hour and the cells would rupture. Sunscald. Why white, she said without looking up from her book. Reflected heat, he said. White bounces the sunlight back. Keeps the bark from heating up too fast during the day. Like the white roofs in the science book. In Greece. Something like that. By the 5th tree, his shoulders had started to ache in that familiar way that reminded him he was 42 and had been doing physical labor since he was 16. He kept painting. He'd have to do a second coat on some of these, he could already tell. That meant more paint, more money, more time. Lily looked up from her book. You're painting them like fences. That's right. But they're not fences. No, they're not. She thought about this for a moment, then went back to her diagrams. Marcus could feel her filing the information away, organizing it into whatever mental system she used to make sense of a world where her mother was dead and her father painted trees white in February while the neighbors drove by slow. The pickup truck appeared on East Road around 11:30. Marcus heard it before he saw it, the particular rattle of a Ford F-250 with a loose exhaust bracket, a sound he'd learned to recognize over 12 years of living on this road. Dale Whitmore's truck. Dale Whitmore, who owned 800 acres of peach trees on the other side of the county, who'd been growing peaches since before Marcus had been born, who showed up at every county extension meeting with a styrofoam cup of coffee and an opinion about everything. The truck slowed. Marcus kept painting. Dale rolled down his window and leaned his elbow on the frame. He was somewhere in his 60s, face weathered to the texture of old leather, wearing a John Deere cap pulled low over his eyes. He didn't say anything for a long minute. Just stared at the white trunk, then at the bucket of paint, then at Marcus, then back at the trunk. Well, Dale said finally, and his voice carried that particular Georgia drawl that could make anything sound like an insult or a joke depending on how you chose to take it. In 30 years of growing peaches on 800 acres, I have seen a lot of things. I have seen late frosts and early thaws, and one time I saw a tornado pick up a tractor and set it down 2 fields over without scratching the paint. But I have never, in all that time, seen a man paint his orchard like a picket fence. He laughed. It wasn't a mean laugh, exactly. It was the laugh of a man who had seen enough things go wrong in agriculture to find genuine amusement in someone else's strange decisions. It was the laugh of a man who assumed he knew more than you because he'd been doing it longer. Marcus didn't respond. He dipped the brush, let the excess paint drip back into the bucket, and started on the next trunk. The brush strokes were steady. Even. He'd learned a long time ago that you couldn't argue with people like Dale Whitmore. You couldn't explain yourself. The frost alert hit Marcus's phone at 4:47 p.m., a sharp buzz against his thigh that made him set down the wrench he'd been using to tighten the irrigation valve. He pulled the phone out, thumbs smearing grease across the screen, and read the National Weather Service alert twice. Temperatures dropping to 19 degrees Fahrenheit within 36 hours. A killing freeze. In late March, when the buds were already swelling pink and vulnerable on every branch in his 12 acres. 19 degrees. The number sat in his chest like a stone. He walked into the kitchen and spread everything across the table. Burlap sacks he'd bought at auction 3 years ago for 50 cents apiece. Old bed sheets from the linen closet, the ones Claire had picked out at Target the spring before she got sick, pale yellow with tiny white flowers. Agricultural fabric still folded in its original packaging from the farm supply store, $20 a roll, bought 2 years ago after a close call with a late frost that never materialized. He'd shoved it in the shed and told himself he'd be ready next time. Next time was here. She watched him measure and calculate, his hands moving over the fabric like he was reading Braille. 70 trees, maybe, if they wrapped tight and didn't waste a square inch. 70 out of 212. Not enough. Never enough. We're gonna wrap the trees, he said, and his voice came out steadier than he felt. All of them? As many as we can. She didn't ask why. She'd grown up on this farm, had seen frost turn blossoms to brown mush on the branch, had understood since she was old enough to walk that weather wasn't something you complained about. It was something you survived or you didn't. They started at sunset. Marcus strapped the headlamp over his beanie and showed Lily how to drape the fabric over the delicate branch tips where the buds were already splitting green, how to gather it gently so the twine wouldn't cut into the bark, how to tie the knot twice because the wind would work it loose otherwise. Her small hands moved carefully, methodically, the way she did everything. She had Claire's patience. Claire's focus. The temperature dropped hour by hour. By 9 o'clock, Marcus could feel it in his fingertips even through the work gloves. By 11, their breath fogged white in the beam of his headlamp, and Lily had stopped talking to conserve energy. She worked beside him in silence, a small figure in a puffy coat that was last year's size, the sleeves riding up her wrists. Midnight came, and the cold deepened into something personal. The kind of cold that found every gap in your clothing and settled there. Lily's fingers had gone clumsy despite her gloves, and when she fumbled a knot for the third time, Marcus saw her jaw clench the way it did when she was trying not to cry. "Go inside," he said. "The trees need all the hands they can get." Her voice was small but certain, and she picked up the twine and tried again. Marcus looked at her for a long moment, this 9-year-old girl who had already buried her mother and learned to paint tree trunks and was now wrapping peach buds at midnight in freezing cold, and he felt something crack open in his chest that he couldn't afford to feel right now. He turned back to the tree and kept working. At 2 in the morning, the cold had teeth. Marcus worked faster, his movements mechanical, desperate, the way a man moves when he knows he's losing. He thought about Claire. About the 3 years of medical debt he'd paid off by selling fruit at a loss, about the mortgage on the farmhouse that came due in April, about the savings account that had been bleeding slow for months. He thought about the fact that if he lost this crop, he lost everything. Lily stumbled. Her knee hit the frozen ground with a sound that was too loud in the quiet, and she let out a sharp breath that was almost a yelp. Marcus was there in 3 steps, scooping her up, and she was lighter than she should be, lighter than a 9-year-old had any right to be. Her jeans were torn at the knee, and there was blood welling up dark against her skin. "I'm okay," she said, but her teeth were chattering so hard the words came out broken. The first buds broke dormancy on a Tuesday in mid-March, and Marcus almost missed them because he'd stopped looking for miracles. He was checking the southwest face of row 7, the trees that had taken the worst damage last year, the ones Dale Whitmore had pointed at from his truck and called deadwood walking, when he saw it. Tiny green nubs pushing through bark that should have been split and brown, the way it had been every spring since Claire got sick. "They lived, didn't they?" she said, and it wasn't a question. She was looking at the buds the way another kid might look at Christmas lights, and Marcus felt something shift in his chest that he'd spent 3 years teaching himself not to feel. By April, you could see the difference from East Road. Marcus's orchard was a wall of green so dense it looked painted on, while the neighboring farms showed the patchy, stunted growth of trees that had taken the frost full force without protection. He caught Dale Whitmore driving past 3 times in 1 week, slowing his truck to a crawl each time, his face unreadable behind the glare of his windshield. He never stopped. Marcus didn't expect him to. Men like Dale didn't know how to ask questions without admitting they'd been wrong. Old Man Reeves, who'd been growing peaches in this county since before Marcus was born, cornered him by the fertilizer racks and asked him straight out what he'd done different. Marcus answered simply, the way he always did. Southwest injury. The white paint reflects the heat, keeps the bark from warming up too fast in the sun and splitting when the freeze hits. The science was solid. He'd found it in an Extension Service bulletin from 1987, buried in a library database that Claire had taught him to search when she was still well enough to sit at the computer with Lily on her lap. Some of the men nodded. Some didn't. He wrote down everything in his notebook anyway. May brought the blossoms, and Marcus had forgotten what the orchard looked like in full bloom. Thick clusters of pink covered every painted tree, so dense the branches bowed under their weight, and the air hummed with bees that had found their way back from wherever bees went when there was nothing to pollinate. He stood in the center of row 12 at peak bloom, surrounded by that sound, and for the first time since Claire died he let himself do the math. If fruit set matched bloom density, and there was no reason it shouldn't, the bees were working like they were on a deadline, this crop would be the biggest since before the medical bills started piling up. He didn't say it out loud. He didn't even write it in the notebook. But Lily saw it in his face at dinner that night, and she smiled into her plate like she'd been let in on a secret. She brought her classmates to see the orchard after school in the second week of May, leading a tour with technical explanations about cambium dormancy cycles and solar radiation reflection that made Marcus stop weeding and just listen. The same boy who told her at Christmas that her dad was crazy for painting trees was now asking if his father could borrow her library book. Lily said yes before Marcus could tell her to charge a rental fee, and he realized with a jolt that she'd inherited Claire's generosity along with her patience. June was for thinning. Marcus worked the rows from sunrise to sunset, removing excess fruit by hand so the remaining peaches would grow bigger, sweeter, more uniform. It was painstaking work, the kind that made your shoulders ache and your fingers cramp, but every peach he dropped into the bucket was a calculation. Fewer peaches meant higher quality. Higher quality meant better prices. Better prices meant the mortgage got paid and the savings account stopped bleeding and Lily might get new boots that actually fit before next winter. He photographed everything. The clean, unblemished skin of the fruit on the southwest side, where Sunscald should have left brown scars. The uniform size of the peaches, measured with the calipers Lily handled like a surgeon's tools. She recorded the data in her notebook beside detailed sketches of peach cross-sections, her tongue poking out the corner of her mouth the way it did when she was concentrating. Harvest started the 3rd week of July, and Marcus hadn't felt this kind of exhaustion in years, the good kind, the kind that came from your body doing exactly what it was built to do. But his best picker, the one who moved through the rows like she'd been born among the branches, was Lily. She climbed ladders with the confidence of a child who'd never been told she couldn't, her small hands quick and careful, twisting each peach free without bruising the fruit or tearing the stem. The packing house trucks arrived every other day. Gary Sutton's quality inspector, marked nearly every load as Grade A premium. He held one of Marcus's peaches up to the light on the 3rd delivery, turned it over in his calloused palm, and said, "This what you got from those trees Dale Whitmore called dead?" Marcus nodded. Leonard wrote something on his clipboard and didn't say anything else, but the grade stayed premium. By mid-August, the numbers were inescapable. Marcus sat at the kitchen table. Yield was up 40% over the 3-year average. He calculated it 3 times, certain he'd made an error, certain the math would correct itself if he just ran the numbers again with fresh eyes. It didn't. The profit line sat there on the page like something that belonged to someone else. Lily appeared in the doorway in her pajamas. She brought him a glass of sweet tea, and she leaned over his shoulder to look at the figures. Her eyes tracked down the columns the way he'd taught her, slow and methodical, and when she reached the bottom line she stopped. She pointed at the number with one finger. "Does this mean we can stay?" Marcus couldn't speak for a moment. The word caught somewhere in his chest, tangled up with 3 years of fear and grief and nights spent staring at the ceiling doing calculations that never came out right. He looked at his daughter, at her too short pajamas and her serious face and the way she was waiting for his answer like it was the only thing in the world that mattered. He nodded. Lily didn't cheer. She didn't jump up and down. She walked to the counter, picked up her own notebook, and wrote "stay" in capital letters across a fresh page. Then she underlined it 3 times, closed the notebook, and went back to bed like the matter was settled. On a Tuesday afternoon in late August, the kind of afternoon where the heat shimmered off the pavement in waves and even the cicadas seemed too tired to make noise, Dale Whitmore's truck pulled into Marcus's driveway. Marcus was in the equipment shed, sharpening the blades on the mower, and he heard the engine cut off and the door open and the slow crunch of boots on gravel. He walked out wiping grease on his jeans and found Dale standing by the tailgate with his cap in his hands, looking at the orchard like he was seeing it for the first time. He asked about the paint. Not mocking now, not the way he'd asked in February when he'd pointed at the dead trees from his truck and told Marcus he was wasting his time. Curious. What brand, what dilution, what application method? Marcus walked him to the house and showed him the Washington State Extension Bulletin, the one Claire had helped him find in the library database when she was still well enough to sit at the computer with Lily on her lap. He showed him the photographs, before and after, dated and labeled, the southwest bark in January and the same bark in June. He showed him the temperature logs, the frost alert records, the notes on cambium dormancy cycles written in his cramped handwriting. Dale read everything. His weathered face stayed unreadable, the same face that had looked at Marcus in the co-op parking lot and told him he was crazy for painting trees white. He turned the pages slowly, his thick fingers careful on the paper, and when he reached the last page he closed the binder and stood there for a long moment without saying anything. "I lost 40 trees last winter," he finally said. "Southwest side. Just like you said." He asked if he could copy Marcus's notes. Marcus handed him the entire binder without hesitation, because what was the point of figuring something out if you weren't going to share it? 2 weeks later, Robert Gaines arrived with a camera and a digital recorder. Marcus Carter pulled his truck onto the highway with Lily in the passenger seat, her boots not quite reaching the floorboard, and headed toward the nursery in the next county. And Lily pressed her palm against the window, leaving a small handprint on the cold glass. She'd been quiet since breakfast, the way she got when something important was about to happen, processing things on her own schedule like always. Marcus had called ahead 3 days ago, asking specifically about the variety he needed, and the woman on the phone had said they had 3 left from the fall shipment. He'd put his name on one without hesitating. Lily unbuckled her seatbelt before the truck had fully stopped, and Marcus didn't tell her to wait. She was old enough now to know when something mattered. She stopped in front of the 3rd sapling and looked up at Marcus. "This one," she said, like there was never any question. "The roots are healthy. No crown gall." Esther rang them up at the counter, and when she looked at Marcus's name on the credit card slip, something shifted in her face. "Carter," she said. "You're the one with the painted orchard." It wasn't a question. Marcus nodded once, cautious, the way he'd learned to be when people brought up the paint. He'd spent too many months being the punchline to trust curiosity right away. But Esther was already shaking her head, pulling a $10 bill from the register and sliding it across the counter. "Half price," she said. "My son-in-law works for the co-op. He told me about your harvest numbers. About the case study." She looked at Marcus with the kind of respect that came from someone who understood what it meant to bet everything on a hunch and win. Marcus picked up the $10 bill, folded it carefully, and tucked it into his shirt pocket without a word. Some things didn't need a speech. He carried the sapling to the truck like it was made of glass, laying it gently in the bed with the root ball wrapped in damp burlap, and Lily climbed back into the passenger seat and buckled herself in without being asked. The drive home was quiet, the way good moments often were, and when they pulled into the farm, the afternoon light was already slanting golden across the eastern fence line where the old tree had stood for 40 years. The stump was still there, silvered and weathered, a monument to every harvest that had come before. Marcus grabbed the shovel from the equipment shed, and Lily followed him across the field without being called. He chose a spot 10 feet from the old stump, close enough to honor the memory but far enough for the new roots to spread. The November soil was hard, compacted by years of foot traffic and tractor ruts, and Marcus had to put his weight behind the shovel to break through. Lily cleared away the clods with her bare hands, her fingers reddening in the cold, and she didn't complain once. Marcus paused, leaning on the shovel, looking at the old stump. His breath clouded in the air. He told Lily about the day his father had planted that tree, back when the farm was still young and the rows hadn't been laid out yet. His father had been a young man then, newly married, full of plans he hadn't yet learned the world would test. He'd dug the hole himself, the same way Marcus was digging now, and when he'd finished, he'd looked at Marcus's mother and said something Marcus had never forgotten. A man who plants a peach tree believes in the future. It was the kind of thing his father said, simple, stubborn, true in a way that didn't need explanation. Lily asked if Grandpa would be proud of what they did. The question hung in the cold air, and Marcus considered it the way he considered everything, slow and careful, turning it over in his mind like a stone he was checking for cracks. His father had been a man who respected results, not intentions. He would have wanted to see the proof. Marcus realized, saying it aloud, that the proof was everywhere now. In the healthy orchard, 212 trees standing in neat rows with their trunks painted ghost white. In the premium contract that had come through in September, the one that paid 30% above market rate.